Adrian Cole had stared down billion-dollar deals without flinching. But now, lying in a hospital bed with a hollow ache in his side and a donor list that had come up empty, he was looking at the one person he'd never thought he'd see again, and the only one who could keep him alive, Layla Marin. Her name alone could still stop his pulse. She stood in the doorway, a contract in her hand, the final consent before the surgeons would even prep him. Her shoulders were squared, but he could see the faint tremor in her fingers. She wasn't here alone. At her side stood a boy, barely tall enough to see over the edge of the bed. Adrian's gaze caught on the shape of the child's mouth, the way his brows furrowed in quiet observation. He didn't need a test to tell him what his chest already knew. This wasn't just about a second chance at life. It was about a truth that had been kept from him for 6 long years. "What would you do?" Adrian asked quietly, voice fraying. "If the only person who could save you was the one you once loved so deeply, you'd have given her your last breath before you broke her heart." The boy's small hand tightened around Layla's. She didn't look away, not this time. "Before I tell you how I ended up here," his voice shifted, as if speaking to you directly, "do me a favor, hit that like button and subscribe, because this isn't just a story about survival, it's about love, loss, and the moment life hands you one last chance to choose differently. Before the machines, before the hospital smell and the quiet weight of unspoken years, there had been a night when nothing existed but the two of them. Adrian could still feel it, as vividly as if he'd just stepped back into her orbit. The studio lights were off, the world outside forgotten. Layla's skin was warm beneath his fingertips, her laughter soft against his ear as he traced the line of her back. She pulled him closer, her lips brushing his jaw before finding his mouth. It wasn't hurried, it wasn't desperate, it was the kind of closeness that made him feel both exposed and safe, as if she could see straight through the armor he wore for everyone else. Her hands framed his face, holding him in a way that told him he wasn't just wanted, he was known. They had moved together slowly, deliberately, memorizing each other with the kind of reverence reserved for rare, irreplaceable things. The air had been warm, their breathing syncopated, their bodies fitting in a way that felt inevitable. That night, he hadn't been the man chasing deadlines and boardroom victories. He had been hers, entirely. The memory faded as the sound of the monitor beside him pulled him back into the present. Layla stood there, different now, stronger, guarded, but his body remembered every detail of the woman who once loved him without conditions. And now she was the only one who could save him. Adrian Cole measured his mornings by the second. By 5:30 a.m., he'd finished his workout, showered, and read through the latest market reports while sipping a precisely timed espresso. At 7, a black sedan slid to the curb, delivering him to the glass tower that bore his company's name. His office, perched above the city, was all sharp lines and quiet authority. Every item in its place, every schedule accounted for. Assistants moved around him like pieces on a chessboard, anticipating his next move before he voiced it. Investors described him as unshakable. Competitors called him untouchable. It wasn't arrogance, it was precision, and Adrian believed precision was safety. If everything was controlled, nothing could blindside him. Yet there were moments, rare, fleeting, when he'd catch himself staring out at the skyline, feeling the faint echo of something missing. He'd learned to silence that feeling quickly. Emotions were untidy, and untidiness had no place in the world he'd built. The Investors' Summit was 3 weeks away, and he was deep in preparation when his assistant reminded him of his annual medical exam. Adrian treated it like a box to tick, a formality for insurance records. The clinic was quiet, efficient. He answered questions, submitted to tests, and watched the clock, thinking of the emails waiting for him. When the doctor finally stepped into the room, there was no smile, just a file in one hand and a look that made Adrian's chest tighten. Adrian sat back, willing himself into the calm that had carried him through hostile takeovers and tense negotiations. But this was different. There was no opponent to outthink, no strategy to deploy. The words landed with the weight of a verdict. "Your kidney function is deteriorating rapidly," the doctor said, sliding a chart across the desk. "You'll need a transplant, sooner rather than later." For a moment, the hum of the overhead lights and the distant shuffle of nurses' shoes felt impossibly loud. Adrian's mind tried to make sense of it, run the numbers, find the margin for error, but there was no spreadsheet to fix this. "How long do I have?" His voice was even, but inside, 1,000 thoughts collided. He exhaled slowly, nodding once. The doctor continued, outlining the process, the registry, the slim odds of a fast match. Adrian absorbed it all like a hostile takeover briefing, except this time, his body was the one under siege. Over the next week, he underwent further testing, each appointment pulling him further from the ordered rhythm he had built his life around. His assistant handled the summit preparations without him, while Adrian quietly authorized the hospital to begin the donor search. The first calls came in after a few days. No match. Then more names, more tests, more dead ends. Each no was delivered with a kind of soft sympathy that made him grit his teeth. If you've ever had a moment where life blindsided you, drop a yes in the comments. I want to know your story. Because when it happens, you remember every detail. Late one evening, alone in his office, he opened an email from the transplant coordinator. His eyes scanned down the list of unsuccessful candidates until they caught on the final line. One potential match found. The name was highlighted in urgent red. Layla Marin. For the first time in years, Adrian felt his grip on control slip completely. 7 years earlier, the world had felt sharper, fuller, and for Adrian Cole, it had a name. Layla Marin. They met when his company had sponsored an up-and-coming photography exhibit. She wasn't just taking pictures, she was capturing pieces of people they didn't know they were showing. He'd been drawn to her lens at first, then to her laugh, and finally to the way she looked straight at him, unafraid of who he was or the weight of his name. New Orleans had been their escape. A weekend trip that was supposed to be a quick distraction turned into 3 days of wandering through narrow streets and hidden courtyards. Layla thrived in the city's warmth, pulling him into small cafes and music-filled alleys. She taught him to slow down, to stop measuring life by schedules and instead by moments. One night they returned to their rented apartment late, still dressed from an art show earlier that evening. Layla's hands were in his hair before they even reached the door. Inside they moved with a kind of reverence, as if afraid to waste even a second apart. The night was slow, unhurried, their bodies learning each other the way fingers learn the curve of a familiar key. She had whispered his name like a promise. It was the closest Adrian had ever come to letting someone see the man beneath the title, and that was what frightened him most. He ended it weeks later, citing travel demands and not enough time for a relationship. The truth, the one he never spoke aloud, was that Layla could reach him in places he had spent years keeping locked. Loving her felt too big, too uncertain, and uncertainty to him was danger. He told himself she'd be fine. She was strong, independent. But there were nights when he would think of her and feel the faint ache of something unfinished. He'd bury it under work, convincing himself it was for the best. Until now. The hospital had confirmed her as his only match. Sitting in his office, staring at the phone, his hand hovered over the call button. 7 years of silence stretched between them, heavy and fragile. He had no idea what version of her would answer, if she even would. He pressed the button. The phone rang. Hello? Her voice was exactly as he remembered, low, warm, with a subtle edge that warned him not to waste her time. For a moment, Adrian almost forgot why he'd called. It's me, he said. Adrian. Silence. When she finally spoke, it wasn't with nostalgia. What do you want? He explained the situation in the most stripped-down terms he could manage. The diagnosis, the donor list, the match. Every word felt like it was skirting a cliff. I don't owe you this, she said, not unkindly, but with a firmness that left no room for misunderstanding. Still, she agreed to meet. The cafe was small, tucked on a quiet street, nothing like the places they used to go. She was already there when he arrived. A simple black sweater draped over her shoulders, her hair pulled back. She looked older, but in a way that spoke of strength, not age. They sat across from each other, steam curling from untouched cups. I didn't expect to ever see you again, she said, her gaze steady. His admission felt heavier than it should. She hesitated before glancing toward the window. That was when Adrian noticed the small figure seated at the next table, coloring in a book. The boy looked up, and Adrian felt the air leave his lungs. The same eyes, the same quiet focus, his own features looking back at him, younger and unguarded. Layla followed his gaze. His name is Isaiah, she said softly. He's 6. Adrian struggled to speak, his mind fighting to keep pace with the revelation. You never told me. You made it clear you didn't want the life that came with me, she replied. And I wasn't going to let him grow up feeling like an afterthought in your world. Her words were matter of fact, but beneath them was the weight of choices she'd carried alone. Pattern interrupt. Layla's POV. When I saw his name on the caller ID, my first instinct was to ignore it. 7 years is a long time to live without someone, and I taught myself not to imagine him walking back through my life. But when the hospital explained why he'd reached out, I couldn't deny the knot that formed in my chest, not because of him, But because I knew Isaiah might ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. Adrian leaned forward, his voice low. I don't want to force my way into his life, Layla, but I'm asking for a chance, for both of us. Her expression was unreadable, a mixture of guarded memory and the faintest flicker of something softer. What would you do in Layla's shoes? Tell me in the comments, because this is where the choice stops being simple. Celine Hart had always fit neatly into Adrian's life. She was elegance without excess, the type who could glide through a gallery opening, speak with perfect courtesy to strangers, and leave without a single wrinkle in her dress. Their relationship was comfortable, predictable, and free from the kind of complications Adrian had once sworn off. She never pressed for more than he could give. That had been part of her appeal. But lately, Celine had been watching him differently. At dinner, she caught the way his gaze would drift, the way he'd check his phone as if waiting for a message he couldn't ignore. She noticed when his wine glass stayed full, when his responses lagged a second too long. One evening they were at a quiet restaurant when she finally asked, "Where are you, Adrian? Because I know it's not here." He hesitated, his mind tangled with the image of Layla's eyes meeting his across that cafe table. "I've had a lot on my plate," he said, defaulting to the vague efficiency he used in board meetings. Celine set her fork down, folding her hands. "I don't know who she is," she said evenly, "but I know she's the one in your head when you're sitting across from me." Her words lingered with him long after the meal ended. In his car, on the way home, he couldn't shake the truth of them. The next morning he met Layla at the hospital to discuss the logistics of the surgery. She was punctual, dressed simply, and carried herself with the same quiet certainty she'd always had. "I'll do it," she said before he could speak, "but there's a condition." His shoulders tensed. "Name it. You don't get to walk into Isaiah's life because of a surgery," she said firmly. "If you want to be his father, you have to earn it. He needs to know you as more than a name, and if you can't commit to that, we keep things as they are." Adrian's jaw tightened. "You think I wouldn't commit to him?" "I think," Layla replied, her tone measured but unyielding, "that you've lived a life where everything bends to your schedule. Children don't. You can't pencil them in between meetings and call that fatherhood." He took a step closer. "You left without giving me the choice." Her eyes flashed. "Because you already made it. You chose yourself. You chose your empire. You walked away before I could even tell you what was coming." The truth hit like a body blow. He told himself 1,000 stories about why she'd left, each one neatly absolving him of responsibility. But standing here, the reality was unavoidable. "I didn't know," he said, quieter now. "You didn't want to know," she countered, "and maybe that was for the best at the time. But this is different. If you want to be in his life, you start showing up now, not after surgery. You start proving you can be the man he needs, not the one you used to be." The words lodged in his chest, equal parts challenge and demand. Outside the hospital window, the late afternoon light softened, throwing long streaks across the floor. Adrian studied her face, the same one he'd memorized years ago, only now set with lines of resolve he hadn't seen before. "I can't undo the past," he said finally, "but I can show you, and him, that I'm not the same man." Layla didn't smile. "We'll see." She turned to leave, but paused at the doorway. "Don't think this is about gratitude for the surgery. It's about trust. And trust isn't given. It's earned." When she was gone, Adrian stood alone in the room, the weight of her words pressing against him harder than any corporate battle ever had. For the first time in years, he realized there was no negotiation tactic, no merger, no transaction that could secure what he wanted most. The hum of the city faded as Adrian stepped into Layla's photography studio. The space smelled faintly of coffee and warm paper, with framed prints leaning against the walls in careful disorder. A single lamp cast a soft circle of light over her workstation, where she sat editing an image on a wide monitor. She didn't look up right away. "You're late," she said quietly, her eyes still on the screen. "I know," he replied, his voice lower than he intended. "I almost didn't come." That made her glance at him, not with surprise, but with something closer to curiosity. "Why?" "Because every time I see you, I remember how I left." He stepped closer, the click of his shoes muffled by the worn rug underfoot. "And it makes me wonder why you'd even let me in the door." Layla leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. "Maybe I was curious to see if you'd actually show up." He studied her face in the lamplight, the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the slight curve of her lips as if she were holding back a dozen things she could say. "Do you want the truth?" he asked. "That depends," she said. "Are you capable of giving it?" He let out a slow breath. "Because loving you was the only thing I couldn't control." The words seemed to still the air between them. For a long moment she just looked at him, as if weighing whether to believe him. "That terrified you?" she asked finally. "Yes," he admitted. "It still does." Her gaze softened, though it didn't lose its edge. Fear isn't a reason to destroy something good. He moved closer until he was standing beside her chair. She didn't lean away when he reached for her hand. The kiss came slowly, hesitantly at first, then with the weight of years compressed into one moment. It wasn't urgent. It was careful. An apology, a memory, and a promise woven together. When they parted, she looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen in years. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something that might lead there. 2 days after the night in the studio, Adrian's phone rang with the hospital's number flashing across the screen. He answered immediately. "Mr. Cole," the coordinator began, "there's a complication. Ms. Marin's pre-op blood work flagged a rare condition. It's not a disqualifier, but it requires additional preparation before we can move forward." His grip on the phone tightened. "How long will that take?" 2 to 3 weeks minimum, and she'll need further testing before surgery can be scheduled. The number of days she just named felt like a chasm. In the space between now and then, too much could happen. He was at the hospital within an hour, waiting in a small consultation room. When Layla walked in, she carried herself as if the delay was nothing more than an inconvenience. "You heard," she said, setting her bag on the chair beside her. "I heard," he replied, his voice sharper than he intended. "This isn't just a delay, Layla. It's time we might not have—" She held his gaze. "I'm not afraid of the tests. You shouldn't be either. I'm afraid of losing you before I can make this right." Her expression faltered for just a moment before she masked it. "Then use the time. Show Isaiah who you are. That will matter more than the date on a surgery schedule." Her words stayed with him as he left. He drove without a destination, finally pulling into the parking garage of his building well past midnight. Celine was waiting in the lobby, dressed simply, a small envelope in her hand. "I've been thinking," she said as he approached, "and I realized something. I want someone whose heart is fully with me. Yours isn't. It hasn't been for a while." He didn't argue. She handed him the envelope, her apartment key. "I hope she's worth it. She always was," he said quietly. Celine gave a small nod, turned, and walked out into the night without looking back. Standing there holding the key, Adrian felt no relief in the simplicity of her departure, only a heavier awareness of the choices ahead and the urgency of the time slipping away. The hospital was quieter than usual that morning, but to Adrian, every sound felt amplified. The squeak of shoes on the polished floor, the faint hum of medical equipment behind closed doors. He sat in a waiting area outside pre-op, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped tight enough to whiten his knuckles. Layla was somewhere down the hall, being prepped. He pictured her under the bright lights, surrounded by strangers in scrubs, and his stomach knotted. A nurse stepped in, clipboard in hand. "We're about to begin," she said gently. He nodded, but his voice caught. "Take care of her." The hours dragged. He checked the wall clock too often, as if staring at the hands could push them forward. At one point, he stood by the window, watching the city below, willing himself not to imagine the worst. Finally, the surgeon appeared, mask hanging around his neck, expression calm. "The procedure was a success. Both patients are stable. She'll need time to recover, but the transplant went well." Adrian exhaled for what felt like the first time in days. They moved him to a recovery room, the dull ache in his side a reminder of what they'd both endured. He fought the pull of sleep until they let him see her. Layla lay resting, her breathing steady, a faint flush of color returning to her cheeks. She opened her eyes briefly, managed a small smile, and whispered, "Told you I'd be fine." It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him believe they'd both just stepped into something new. Adrian's recovery was slower than he expected, but it gave him something he'd rarely allowed himself before, unstructured time. He spent it where Layla would let him, learning the rhythms of Isaiah's world. Saturday mornings became their ritual. Isaiah would pull out a mixing bowl twice his size, insisting on making special pancakes that sometimes turned out lopsided, other times burned. Adrian didn't care. He flipped each one as if it were a delicate investment, and they ate them at the kitchen counter, laughing at the odd shapes. Afternoons were for comics. Adrian discovered that his son loved stories about unlikely heroes, ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary situations. They'd sit cross-legged on the floor, Isaiah reading aloud with dramatic voices, Adrian listening as if each page were a report that mattered more than any in his office. One evening, Layla mentioned Isaiah's upcoming school play. Adrian didn't hesitate. He cleared his schedule without a second thought. On the night of the performance, he sat in the crowded auditorium, scanning the stage until he spotted Isaiah in a handmade costume. The boy's eyes lit up when he saw Adrian in the audience, and the wave he gave was small but certain. After the curtain call, Isaiah ran into his arms. "Did you see me?" "I wouldn't have missed it," Adrian said, holding him a little tighter than necessary. Later, Layla lingered at the doorway as Adrian helped Isaiah out of his costume. She didn't say anything, but he saw it, the slight softening in her stance, the way her gaze rested on him for just a moment longer. If you believe people can change, hit the like button right now. It lets me know these stories matter. The evening air was warm, carrying the faint scent of jasmine from the garden. The porch light glowed softly, casting a halo over the wooden steps where Adrian sat. In the yard, Isaiah darted between small flickers of light, cupping his hands to catch fireflies before letting them go again. Layla stepped outside with 2 mugs, handing one to him before settling into the chair beside his. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the quiet hum of summer. Adrian glanced at her, the curve of her profile framed against the fading sky. "It's different here," he said softly. "What is?" she asked. "Everything," he admitted. "The pace, the way time feels, the way you make space for moments that matter." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she watched Isaiah as he laughed to himself, chasing another firefly. "That's the only reason I agreed to meet you again," she said finally, "to see if you could slow down long enough to notice what's right in front of you." He set his mug down, leaning forward. "Layla, no more running." The words came steady, certain, like a vow. "I can't change the years I lost, but I can choose what I do from here. I'm not leaving again. Not you. Not him." Her eyes searched his face, testing the weight of his promise. A faint breeze lifted her hair, and she reached to tuck it behind her ear. "Then stay," she said quietly. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. Those 2 words carried every condition, every hope, and every piece of forgiveness they might one day reach. Adrian reached across the space between them, his hand finding hers. They stayed like that, fingers intertwined, watching Isaiah play under the soft pulse of summer light. They stayed on the porch long after the last firefly had drifted away, the night settling into a quiet that felt almost protective. Adrian didn't look at his watch once. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about tomorrow's meetings, pending contracts, or market forecasts. "I used to believe I could control everything," he said, his voice low. "Every outcome, every risk, even how much I let someone matter to me. I thought if I kept my world contained, I could keep it safe." Layla listened, her gaze steady. "But that's not how life works," he continued. "It doesn't ask for permission before it changes you. It just happens. And you either fight it until you're empty, or you let it in." Her fingers tightened around his. "It's never been about control, Adrian. It's about showing up, about choosing the people you love, every single day." He nodded slowly, the truth of her words settling deep. "Then I choose this. I choose you. I choose him." Somewhere inside the house, Isaiah's voice called out, asking for a glass of water. Layla rose to answer, but not before giving Adrian's hand one last squeeze, a silent acknowledgement of the moment they'd just shared. As she disappeared inside, Adrian leaned back in his chair, staring at the spot where the boy had been running earlier. He realized that the wealth he'd spent his life building was nothing compared to the richness of this, a small porch, warm air, and the quiet certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one, because sometimes the most important stories aren't about power or success. They're about the moments we choose love over everything else.